Welcome, and very excited to talk a little bit about relationships today and the different aspects of relationship that are sometimes a bit overlooked or where there is some misconceptions. So today we're going to look at the three aspects that are often either overlooked or that cause the most trouble in relationship. And I'm going to give you information and also some takeaways and things you can do immediately for your own relationship. Or if you don't have a relationship right now and you want one, then some of this information will allow you to actually explore how to go back into relationship or start a new relationship with a little bit more focus and purpose. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to give you an overview of the three aspects, and then I'm actually going to give you some practice and a bit of a takeaway, and then I'm going to take your questions. So if you have questions and if you want some one-on-one attention, we can do that towards the end of our time together here. So to begin with, I just wanted to say that I've been involved in the field of relationship and sex, intimacy, and everything that goes with that for over 20 years, well over 20 years by now. I started out as a relationship counselor before I started teaching internationally. And I've worked with over 30,000 client hours over this period of time. So I've worked with both individuals and couples in the domain of relationship, sex, and intimacy, and have found that regardless if these are people who are just starting out a relationship or people in long-term relationship, as some of you know, I'm also working with celebrities and people who are in high performance. The issues and the questions are always the same, regardless of where people sit. And so the single most important aspect of relationship, believe it or not, is not the sex. That's kind of the second aspect that people come with issues. And the first one is not having aligned one's purpose. So we're actually going to talk about how do you align the purpose of a relationship? How do you define the why of your relationship? And what are you bringing to the relationship, which then in turn also shows whom you are attracting. So that's the first thing we're going to talk about, because that's really, really important. And that's where a lot of issues begin. And often when we hear that people have gotten divorced because of what's called in America irreconcilable differences, it is because those alignments were never consciously taken into account when there was still time to do so, meaning in the earlier parts of the relationship. These alignments are also really important if you are in a long-term relationship and you are growing and changing either together or apart. So we're going to look at that as well. Then the second aspect that we're going to look into today in a bit of detail is what happens when the spark is gone. Why does the spark go? How do you bring the spark back? And then the third one is essentially connected to the other two, which is how do we switch between the go mode, which is the aspect of us that needs to get stuff done in the world, and the flow mode, which allows us to be connected to our body, connected to our pleasure, connected to our sexuality, connected to another human as a means of intimacy and connection. So those are the three things we're going to look at. And I'm going to give you a good overview and then some actual practical tools on each of them. And as I said, then I'm going to take some questions for the remainder of the time, and you'll have two options here. You'll be able to type them into the chat function, or you can also raise your hand and actually work one-on-one with me. So both of those are an option. So let's talk a little bit about the why of relationship. So when we look at the why, what we're actually doing is we're looking at the purpose of this relationship, whatever that purpose is. And what that means is that different people have different ideas of what a relationship is about. It used to be super easy because it used to be that it was expected that if you met somebody, eventually you would move in together, then you would get married, then you would have children, then the children would leave the house and you would happily retire together. That was kind of the prevailing wind of the societal idea of how relationship would go. And regardless if that's a realistic expectation or not, that is essentially what everybody expected. So when people got together, like for instance, people of my parents' generation, that was kind of the trajectory of how it was. And so it didn't really need to be discussed in great detail, or if it was discussed in the context of getting married. Nowadays, of course, we have a completely different situation as far as our options and our choices. And that's incredibly good. And it's, of course, also incredibly valuable that we can make those choices. But often when there is a lot of choice and when there is very different ideas on how to be in relationship, there can be a bit of miscommunication, misunderstanding, or misalignment as far as what do two different people want in a relationship. So nowadays, of course, we don't have to get married anymore. Nowadays, we can have children by ourselves. We can have children without a father, with a sperm donor. We can still do the traditional marriage and children situation. We can have same-sex relationships. We can have open marriages. We can have people living in different houses. There's all kinds of additional aspects that are available that can be somewhat confusing when you're trying to align yourself with a partner. This, of course, nowadays starts already with dating, because with dating apps, there is a somewhat of a disconnect as to what you can find out about that person before you actually meet them. It looks like you find out a lot more, but of course, what you're actually hearing is a very curated picture of that person that does not always align with what they're really about. So when we look at the why in relationships, what we're essentially doing is we're lining things up. That the number one aspect of good relationship is actually commonality. So there's two options here that we can play with, and we'll look at in detail at that when we look at why is the spark gone. But good relationship is usually based on having things in common, on common goals, common values, agreements around all the things that bring the relationship into alignment and make it move forward. And that's easy things like, do you eat meat or not? What religious affiliation or political affiliation do you have? Do you like sports or not? Things of that nature. That's how we form commonality with a partner. And then communication is a very important aspect of that. So when we define the why, what we're essentially doing from the beginning is we're bringing both partners onto the same page, or if they're no longer on the same page, they can come back to the same page. So I'll give you an example of why the why is so important. This is a very common one. People get together, and of course, in the beginning, you don't talk much about the future because you don't even know if it's going to work or not. And with that, of course, you don't discuss the really important aspects. And there might be, two people getting together. This is a classic nowadays. And they're both saying, oh, well, we'll become digital nomads or something like that. We're going to travel the world together. We'll have adventures. We'll work wherever we can. We're entrepreneurs. We'll start our business there, or, things of that nature. And so that's a common goal. right? That's a clear why in the relationship. Why are we together? We're together to have fun and be adventurous and travel the world. And then what often happens is one of the two people suddenly changes the purpose of the relationship. So a classic changer of the purpose of relationship is, I would like to have a baby. I want to get married or not. I'd like to have a baby. Well, when you're traveling the world and you're in wild locations, that might not be the best way to go. Could be, but might not be. So suddenly one person is going, I want to settle down, or I want to stay static. And the other person is still going, I want to travel the world. And so suddenly you have divergent purpose of relationship. And then, of course, what has to happen is you have to realign. And in an ideal world, that happens organically. In an ideal world, what happens is both people come to the conclusion of the next stage of the relationship together. That's what good communication is about. And then realign their circumstances and their life and do the next thing. And then let's say they have some children, and now the realignment is towards parenting, away from wild adventure, or from crazy sexual explorations or drug explorations or whatever people set out to do. It shifts, hopefully, as everybody grows and develops. And then on occasion, it's good to check again, is the goal or the purpose still aligned? Are we still on the same page? And when that's done consciously, it doesn't come out in passive aggressive or submerged or acting out ways. So defining the why of relationship any step along the way is super useful. And it doesn't have to be a big deal. It's just something to know and something to be clear on. And in my 20-something years of counseling people and working with people, that's usually the thing that people have never done. And it's so self-evident once you actually think about it. And it's such a good and relationship-forming habit that once you understand how to do that and why to do that, it's actually something that really adds greatly to a relationship. So with that said, what can you do? Well, the easiest and with that, most effective way is to actually come up with the questions that you need to ask yourself and the questions that you need to ask your partner, and then compare those questions. Either if you are in a good place and you know how to do that, you can just sit together, or you can also take those questions and those ideas to, let's say, a coach or a therapist. And if you are not in relationship and you would like to be in relationship, it's good to ask yourself those kind of questions before you even fill out a dating profile or go on a first date. It's not to say that you will lead with that on a first date, but if you are clear and if you filter your attention to somebody through the things that you've defined as important and through the things that you define as your purpose, that really makes a big difference. The second aspect of this is to actually examine what is it that you bring to a relationship. Often we are told that we should have a wish list or a manifestation list or a checklist where we essentially have our ideal mate spelled out. And that's really important, but it's equally important to spell out what it is that you are bringing. What are your contributions? What are your gifts? What are your talents? What are you about? Because when that's not aligned, what you want and who you are, then that's not a good match, even though you think theoretically it is. So I'll give you an example of that. Let's say you want a man. I'm now talking about somebody who wants a man, could be a woman too, right? But let's say you want a man who is super adventurous and kind of an explorer and has kind of a wild side. but then it turns out you are actually a couch potato who thinks that, an evening with popcorn and Netflix is kind of the best thing, then you're not actually matched with an adventurer and explorer. Or the other way around, this sometimes happens too, right? There's somebody saying, well, I want to be with a person who really supports me and connects with me and is there for me and, takes care of the home. But then that person isn't actually supporting the person who's supposed to take care of the home, because they are poled totally different. So it's super important to do that. I would recommend to do it often. As a matter of fact, when I still used to see, couples every single day, I did that for, I think, 18 or 20 years, where I saw 9 clients I did 9 sessions a day, 5 days a week for the entire year. So I've seen an enormous amount of people. What I used to do is I would have them dialogue about the most important questions, so that right then and there, any kind of misunderstandings or misalignments could be caught and worked with. And in the meantime, I have assembled all these questions into documents, and they're actually now available. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but we made an entire toolkit with all the questions that you can ask yourself, and then you can give to your partner, and then you can combine your answers and discuss them, or bring that to a therapist. Or if you're looking for a partner, you fill that out for yourself, and then really look at where are the areas where you want to develop, or where are the areas where there is a misalignment. So with that in mind, doing that periodically, and particularly when it comes to certain kind of pivot points in somebody's life, is very much something that I would recommend, and that I've seen do some amazing work and some amazing healing as well in relationships. So that's the first thing that I wanted to talk about. And the second one being what happens when the spark goes. And part of that, of course, is connected with what I've just talked about. So I was saying a bit earlier that how people get into relationship is essentially a process of getting to know one another. And we've all have at least one memory, most of us more than that, of that magical process when you actually meet someone for the first time. And you suddenly discover you have some things in common. This could be anything from an obscure love for, hill tribe Thai food to French poetry from the 1400s or something like that. Or you have friends in common, or you share love for a sports team or things like that. Often that's how we get connected with someone with whom we are romantically involved. There's this moment of the recognition, the moment of finding commonality. And that commonality is what first makes us interested. And then, of course, there's the spark, the erotic, that excitement that comes when you meet someone new, which is basically, well, it's a number of things, but it's basically the newness, the excitement, the not knowing, the being different. And there's also, of course, chemistry and biochemistry involved that has to do from everything to, from pheromones all the way to recognition of childhood imprints in that other person. But it's this amazing and really exciting and exhilarating cocktail of feelings and sensations when we meet someone new. And then there's that spark, and then you talk and you find out things about each other all night long when you're not having amazing makeout sessions or sex or whatever your style of getting to know somebody is. And then, of course, what happens is you get to know that person more and more and more. You're more and more able to actually relate to that person based on commonality. So you're far, far away from each other when you first meet. Everything's new, everything's exciting. And then you start coming closer and closer together. You might start spending more time together. Now you have common friends, you have common activities. Maybe you're now, living in the same place. Eventually, there's enough commonality that the newness and the excitement that makes two people be far away from each other as far as knowledge and understanding of each other goes. And as we come closer and closer together, the relationship gets better because the relationship is built on commonality, but the spark goes because the spark is built on opposition, on being opposites that attract. I always say that there's these two statements that people always say, one of which is opposites attract. And that's true for the spark, for the sexual attraction, for what we sometimes call the erotic friction. The other one is birds of a feather stick together. And that is the principle behind the commonality, the common goals, the common purpose. So it's much, much harder finding somebody with whom you're aligned purpose-wise than it is to find somebody with whom you have that spark, because the spark is primarily newness and excitement and the difference. So what typically happens is you move in together, now you have common memories, you have a common language, you have your pet peeves, you have your places that you connect, you have your common values, you do things together, you come closer and closer and closer. And as you do that, you'll have that drop in the excitement, the drop in the spark. When that happens, often people get really, really worried. And something that used to be just a part of the relationship, a small part of the relationship, the sexual aspect, becomes this big deal because now all the focus goes on it being gone. Most people I've worked with report that first time when they went over to their new partner and they didn't have sex. And it's like, what happened? What's going on? Is this person going off me? What's changed? Well, that's very natural as you progress through a relationship, that there isn't always that as the primary driver. Other things take its place. And so we have a lot of self-worth and a lot of concern wrapped up in our sexual attractiveness and our sexual prowess. But in a good relationship, in a healthy relationship, that's a completely normal thing. Now, the good news is when you know the principles of erotic attraction, you can always create erotic attraction. It's not that easy to create that good common values and common goals. And typically, there's kinds of styles around this. There's people who constantly fight. They constantly have the friction of the erotic friction, right? Which is that difference, the not kind of fitting together really well, which I'm doing this here because there's a rub, and that rub is what makes the sex hot, right? You don't know each other. You don't actually fit together well. You're on the opposite ends of the spectrum. It's hot, but it's also laden with friction sometimes. And so there's people who have very contentious relationships, but great sex for many years to come. And then there's people who have really lovely relationships, but the sex starts getting a little bit less exciting or not exciting at all. So the focus here is to see, is the relationship strong? Is the purpose aligned? Is the connection between two people a deep, wonderful, intimate, connection? And if that's so, then you can start learning the principles of erotic friction. So I'm going to give you a few specific things you can do so that you know what you're doing when that happens. So the first one, and this is so self-explanatory that anytime I've said this to a couple, they're like, oh, yeah, okay, yeah. So the first one is remember what worked when you were dating. And what I mean by that is there's some very specific principles in the dating experience that you can recreate. So typically, when we go on a date with somebody whom we find exciting sexually and otherwise, we go through a number of steps that get us ready for the date. So here are some of the things, just so that you remember them. You make a time. So you set aside time. You have a specific time that you meet this person, and typically you go somewhere or you do something. So there's an activity involved, often a new activity, because that's what happens in the beginning. And you make a time and you take that time. So meaning you don't have a work meeting while you're meeting with that person. If you have a little bit of etiquette, you're also not constantly checking your phone while you're on a brand new date, if this is somebody you are excited about. You're getting ready, meaning you put some time aside before then to actually get into the mood for that date. And that can be anything from picking out an outfit you enjoy or just brushing your teeth or anything in between, but you're getting ready. You don't see that person till you're actually ready and you come together with the purpose of enjoying each other's company. And then you have interesting things to talk about. So those are the takeaways for how do you recreate the spark. And I know that's not always easy or fun because people get comfortable, but there isn't much sexiness in sitting next to each other on the sofa with the sweatpants, with one bowl of popcorn in front of some rerun of Game of Thrones. That might be very good for the heart and the relationship, but it's not very sexy. So when you want to recreate the spark, you're gonna keep the following ingredients in mind, so to speak. Make time, create something new, prepare. And what I mean with prepare is give it the attention it deserves, and give your partner the attention they deserve, which is connected, of course, meaning don't get distracted. And then the single most important one, be interesting, be exciting, be new. So how do you become interesting, exciting, and new? Well, you don't talk about the stuff that you talk about all the other times of the day. And that for most couples is really, really hard. Most couples, even if they do a date night, right, they drive there together, and on the way there, whatever there is, they're talking about the kids and who takes the dog to the vet and who threw up where on whom and which bill wasn't paid and how bad was it at work. While that's important, and there's other places for that in the relationship, it doesn't exactly ignite the spark. So I call that date night discipline. And there's a whole bunch of really cool tips around date night discipline, many of which I just gave you, but it's just having time to really not talk about those things. And it's really interesting when you try that out, how hard it is to not slide into some complaint or report or to do, I sometimes call it the administrivia of life, and actually talk about something that you typically don't talk about. And becoming interesting again to your partner will sometimes require that you do some activities that you can report on that are new and exciting, or that you read something, or that maybe you go out with your friends and come back a bit refreshed and feeling a little bit renewed as to who you are, and so that you are your own person. So those are the most important aspects to recreating the spark. And then the second one that I want to mention that's easy to recreate for you at home and that you can take out of this talk is leading and following. So we talked a little bit about the different aspects of how people are in their lives, meaning how they go back and forth between being, very close and very aligned, and a bit separate and in different camps, so to speak. I often talk about this as go and flow, and we'll talk about how to shift from go to flow in a moment. But go is the part of all of us that gets stuff done. It's a part of us that thinks and talks like we're doing right now, the part of us that has a plan, the part of us that knows when to be where and why, the part of us that operates kind of on a trajectory or a grid. Flow is the part of us that connects us to our body and to life itself in the form of food and clothing and connection with other people and music and art and creation and feeling and pleasure and all of those things. We both have both. And in an ideal world, we both have but we'll all, I should say, each partner has both really well developed. And then where leading and following comes in is that what makes the sexual attraction, the erotic friction strong is when there's one of each. So there's one person who enacts the go and one person who enacts the flow. And that doesn't always have to be the same person. So you could switch off, can go also seamless within the occasion, but that's where leading and following comes in. So the leader, so to speak, is the go person who makes maybe the plan, says where it's going, holds a certain structure, knows what this is all about, and flow, whoever goes in flow, just enjoys themselves and goes along with the flow and feels the enjoyment of being led. And so how that would actually look, let's say on a date where you want to recreate the spark, is one person takes over the go part and the other person enjoys themselves. And then on the next date, you flip so that each person gets to lead and each person gets to follow. It's not as easy as it sounds because we have these habits of being in control or these habits of assuming our partners are not doing it right. So right there is a lot of discipline that one needs to begin with, but it's also a lot of fun, and there's many, many ways to work with that. So those are some of the tips on how to recreate the spark, and there are all different kinds of resources that we'll have available for you as well on that. Mainly, there's an entire course on how to actually do that and how to do that well, called the relationship course. So within that whole context of what do you need to know about recreating the spark, the most important thing is that you remember what worked to begin with. Now, if nothing ever worked, then that's a different issue. Then you have to look at where you misaligned to begin with. And this brings us back to our first point, because sometimes people don't get into relationship for, let's say, the spark or the sex or the sexual enjoyment. They get into relationship for safety, security, to heal, to have a business arrangement or things like that. So if your purpose of relationship doesn't include the sexual spark and you've never had it, then that's a whole other conversation that has to be had within the context of, if you've never had it, can you actually create it, or are you just no longer aligned in your purpose? So that's it. My last of the 3 points, and then I will happily take your questions if you have any, is go and flow, and how do you switch between go and flow? So within go and flow, it's important to understand that go and flow happens in the body. And I often talk about the intersection of relationship, intimacy, and embodiment, because you can't have one without the other. Typically, and this is still the case at this particular moment in time, we still do sex and intimacy and relationship with the body. Supposedly there's people developing suits and apps and all kinds of stuff. But for most of us, our preferred mode of intimate interaction is body to body. And as humans, our bodies have served us well for the entire time we've developed into human beings. And cognitive development is a fairly recent development in the big scheme of how humans developed. So our bodies actually hold a lot of very important and ancient information, not only survival, but also thriving and, of course, reproducing and pleasure and instinct and intuition and all of those things that have served us well through the development of humankind. So within the body lies the source of our ability to live a very full and rich life, because that's where a lot of the enjoyment happens. And one of the reasons for that, of course, is our five senses. So we experience the world in an ideal world through our five senses. Not everybody has all senses, meaning some people can't see or hear or taste or smell or things like that. But in an ideal world, we have them all available. If one sense isn't available, by the way, that typically means other senses get heightened to make up for that, because sensory perception, and with that, sensual pleasure or sensual enjoyment, is really what keeps us alive. So it's not a shameful thing or a thing that we should put aside. It's very fundamental to the well-being of any human. The ability to see, the ability to taste, the ability to touch, and so on, right, is what keeps us alive. It's what keeps us functioning. And in deeper levels, it's what keeps us from dying on one end, but also what allows us to live with great enjoyment. So go and flow are the functions in the body that are connected to the nervous system, so to speak. They're connected to our ability to survive, to get things done, to either flee or fight. It's also connected to our ability to rest and digest, to relax and procreate. And there's a whole, layers of go and flow within us. On a creative and relational level, go and flow means that we're able to switch back and forth between getting things done in the real world. And when I'm saying real world, in the world where we have to make a living and be on Zoom these days and drive places and fly places and bank and whatever we need to do, make decisions. That's our go. And within that go, there's the nervous system, there's our emotions, there's our body, and of course in flow aspects, right? We have flow in our nervous system, we have flow in our emotional capacity, we have flow in our body. And when both are present, this beautiful homeostasis, so to speak, can be created between those different aspects, and we're able to use them both. Unfortunately, most of us spend a lot more time in go than in flow, because most of life is geared towards go. Getting things done, going places, making plans, taking care of business, focusing. And that happens up here. So a lot of the go happens in the upper body, so to speak, because we're thinking, we're speaking, we're doing, we're kind of having this get up and go to our bodies, which means that our energy distribution moves up. And you've all experienced that, because that's what tight neck, clenched jaw, headaches, TMJ, whatever, all of those things are. They're a function of bringing everything up, tightening, focusing forward, using the energy that we have available in the body to get stuff done. Human beings are creatures of habit, meaning whatever you do most is the strongest habitual pattern. So the more time you spend in flow, the more flow must go, the more time you spend in go, the more go muscle do you have. Now you're super muscular up here, so to speak, in a nervous system and doing muscular in go, and you're not that full down here where flow naturally happens. Flow happens in the belly, in the hip, in the pelvic floor, in the thighs. It happens in the sexual organs. It happens in our power centers of the solar plexus here. That's where flow happens. The creativity and the strength and the force of our engine, so to speak, the lower body, is what creates flow. With that, of course, there's sexual function, sexual pleasure, there's intuition, there is available energy. And often we are not as muscled, so to speak, worked out in flow as we are in go. So what that means is when we come home from work and or, you know, you've been home all day. Nowadays, that happens a lot, right? You've been all day home all day on the computer, on the phone, telling people what to do, dealing with kids, dogs, bills. You have a lot of tension up here and a lot of energy up here, a lot of clench up here in the worst case scenario. Now you want to shift into a more relational, playful, romantic, pleasure-filled sexual mode, and the muscles of that are somewhat atrophied, and you're not as easily switching into the parts of your body where enjoyment could happen and where pleasure could happen. And then that, of course, makes you more tight and try more and do more, and then that brings the energy back up, and so it goes. Often that disconnect between the pleasurable, feeling, sensitized parts of us and the going, focused parts of us creates this huge gap where it just feels almost insurmountable to get to actual pleasure and enjoyment and relaxation. And even if we want it, we sometimes don't know how to get there. And so that's why sometimes people have a drink or people do things to help them relax or get into the flow. So I want you to just have a few takeaways from this aspect as well. And the first one is it's very easy to actually access flow. And the reason it is because it comes from the body. And so once you engage with the body and the lower part of your body, the energy immediately reverses out of the head into the lower body, even if you have habitual tension up here. So because it goes through the body, we can just go through the body. We don't have to think our way into flow. We don't have to do special exercises so much as we have to engage with the lower parts of our body. So one of the easiest ways, and I'm going to just show you this for a moment because it's so easy, right, that you can do this anytime, is you're just going to, I'm going to just step back a bit, just going to start bouncing with your thighs a little bit, your knees and your thighs a bit bent, and you just bounce. And you bring your, you keep your feet flat on the ground, so your feet don't come off the ground. That's very important. And you just bounce. And then eventually you can kind of also bounce to the sides, and you can just allow your lower body to become active. So you could do a bit of hip circles. It doesn't have to be very, rhythmic or good looking. You could shimmy a bit, bounce again. So even if you just do 5 or 10 minutes of bouncing and moving your hips, you'd feel a huge difference. And it's very hard to, to make people understand that really that's all it takes, because it's supposedly this big deal. But if you actually just activate the lower part of your body, you'll feel an immediate shift. So that's one of the embodiment exercises you can simply do. There's more detailed and more detailed instructions for different embodiment exercises that we also have available, but this is an easy takeaway that you can try anytime. So the important piece is knowing when you are in go, knowing when you want to get into flow. And then why is it important to do embodiment practice? Well, because when you do embodiment practice, when you engage with the flow aspects of your body, you're training your body to be able to go there quickly and easily when you want to, and quickly and easily when you want to engage romantically, sexually, creatively, intuitively. So the reason we practice those is so that you have equally as much muscle in flow as you have in go, so to speak. So to that extent, I just wanted to say that there's a whole bunch of resources we have available for you if you want to go deeper into that. There's the Relationship Discovery Toolkit, which has 10 distinct sections of actual questions, loads and loads and loads of questions and instructions on how to use it for couples, for individuals, for singles. And then there's a whole section on embodiment practices that you can do in conjunction with these questions to make the questions have deeper answers, but also to shift from go into flow. So that toolkit just was launched a couple of days ago. And for this webinar, we're making it available at a super reduced price. So it's usually 97, it's 47. And Casey posted that in the chat for you. So that's available till this Sunday for the reduced price. In that is loads and loads and loads and loads of resource for how to actually create the why and how to find what you're contributing to a relationship. And then there's all these guided practices where I guide you through different ways of being with your body and your heart so you can make better decisions. There's also the relationship course, which is a really in-depth 5-module course that goes into the sexual aspect, the erotic aspect, the communication aspect, talks about date night discipline and how to get there, how to have meetings with your partner in a way that's effective. And that's been made available via a platform where you also have interactive components and where each module has a guided practice and has kind of my best relationship material from over 20 years. So those are the 2 things that are available. And like I said, Casey posted them here for you. And now I am going to take your questions and talk to me. Hi.
Hello. Amazing. Yeah, so in my relationship, I have really good, like we have a good connection and good, how did you put it? Like we're compatible, you know, in day-to-day things. So that stuff is really easy, but the spark is like over 9 years, like slowly dwindling. And I find it difficult because like I feel like the natural place I want to be is in flow in the dynamic when it's intimacy, but that is not, I can go, so I could be more directional. I find it kind of easy to go either way, but I sort of resent it if I have to be in the go. Part of me feels like not quite fulfilled with that, and I feel like my partner wants to kind of just like relax and switch off because he's go all the time at work and he's getting home and he doesn't want to be go now. He doesn't want to be directional because he's kind of done all of that and he just wants to kind of merge or just be in this like relaxed flow space. Yeah. So I just wonder if you have
yes
tips?
I do, because this is a very, very common thing. And I'm glad you're asking this question, because of course, in an hour, I can't go into everything. So I didn't mention that aspect, but yes. So I want to say that typically we have a preference when it comes to our, let's say, relational, sexual, erotic nature, right? So we tend to like one more than the other. So we tend to either want to be the one who goes on the ride, so to speak, hops on the train, however you want to say that, of the romantic occasion, or we are the ones who like to call the shots and be the one who's driving the train or the car or whatever you want to say, right? So typically we tend to have a preference. And that preference makes it so that we feel the most fulfilled when we get to be in that space when it comes to the erotic. Right? Whatever erotic means to you, could be sex, or could just be a little bit of play or making out or whatever, right? So that's typically what we yearn for or fantasize when we imagine a perfect sexual, escape there for a moment or occasion. It's like, I just I knew exactly where this was going. I was like, kind of doing all this exciting stuff. So that typically happens. So here's a problem with this. When everyone, meaning both partners, or if you're two in a couple, some people are no longer twos in couples, but if two people in a couple, right, both have to go all day, they both want to flow when they come home. And then, of course, when two people flow, it doesn't make for a very exciting sexual occasion either, because you need one of each. Right? In this sexual occasion, you need the polar opposites. You need the opposite attract thing. So the answer to that is, like you said, you get a bit resentful. You don't want to be the one doing it again. Right? So the answer to that is to understand the dynamic, which is both you and your partner will need a moment to just flop. Right? Both you and your partner will need a moment to just let it all go and have that moment of relaxation and flow and whatever. And only when that's done do you shift gear into the opposite parts. And when that's discussed and when that's known, it's not so fraught with the resentment. Right, so that's very important. I sometimes talk about my parents, who are still very happily married and still alive, which is just incredibly wonderful, right? My parents had this whole thing long before, anybody knew anything about this as far as books and seminars. They had this thing where when my dad would come home from work, he had a very stressful and a fairly long commute. He would say hello to us as kids, right? But then he'd go to the bedroom and he'd have time to transition. And in that time to transition, we weren't allowed to go in there. My mom would kind of go in and out. God knows what she did in there. I hope good things. I mean, now when I think back on it, I think there was, a fair share of interesting stuff happening. But he'd be in there. He'd have a shower. He'd get changed. This was, of course, before computers and stuff like that. So he'd probably read a bit or hang out. He'd hang out with my mom. And only then, when he had that time to actually also wash his system, would he come out and then be a father and a husband and all of those things that were required in the next stage of the day. And that's worked really well for them. My parents still have that erotic friction in their 80s, which is really lovely to see. So if you can talk about that and say, okay, we both need that. We both need to actually, just have a moment, and then we'll, with a little bit of consciousness and purpose, come together and play the other thing. And then what you can do is you can say, okay, we'll switch off, right? So one day you are the one leading, the next time he's the one leading. And then it's really clear, and it can't be, it's not so fraught with all the resentments that come into it. So that's a good way to do it. And that's a good, full deepening into a relationship where you say, look, if we want to get the spark back, we're probably going to have to make a bit of an effort. Here's how we're going to do this. Let's make it fun. And so I'm going to give you a tiny little preview of something that's in the relationship course in big detail, which is what I call the jar exercise.
Okay.
And the jar exercise is essentially an exercise where each person kind of writes down things that they would like to have done to them. Mm-hmm. And throws it in a jar. There's more to it, but I'm just giving you a little preview. And then when it's time for you to lead, you can pick one of your partner's wishes out of the jar.
That's great. I love that. Yeah, that's really good.
Yeah. So that's a really, really good one. So that's okay. Here's a question. Is it always possible or wise to rekindle desire during extenuating circumstances, or does the timing of this matter? My boyfriend and I have a wonderful aligned relationship, but the spark has definitely waned due to us both being exhausted. He has recently been promoted and has been feeling the effect of the increased workload, and I have been experiencing some ongoing health issues that require hysterectomy, along with all that entails in the upcoming year. We've been prioritizing our relationship over being lovers at this time. Can we both have the stability and the excitement? We loved your suggestion about the date nights and realized we both have receptive tendencies when we read your book. Thanks so much for your thoughts and sharing your wisdom. Oh, thank you. So, this is a very, very good point. And this brings us back to the alignment of the relationship. Sometimes the alignment of the relationship means you're not hanging off the chandeliers every night. Right. For instance, when you're a young parent, somebody is postpartum, nobody sleeps, you're intensely worried about raising your first child, or your third, or your whatever, right? So there is times where recreating the spark or being intensely sexual isn't the priority and shouldn't be the priority. And I think one of the really quite deadly things about social media is that we think that we have to be everything at all times, which we absolutely don't have to. And particularly in things where you're now looking at a hysterectomy and everything that comes with that, having unrealistic expectations of yourself and of your partner is very detrimental. However, having the spark or having that connection isn't necessarily all about sex. It's about having the attention to each other that's not just parents or roommates or business partners, but a little bit of play, a little bit of sensuality, a little bit of flirting, a little bit of having excitement and fun. So it doesn't have to be, and it shouldn't when that's not appropriate, the wild expectation for constant sex or even, regular sex, but making time and making priority of having that kind of play that feels interesting and that makes you feel like you're actually proper partners. That's really important. So you might not want to go for rekindling a lot of sexual things, but you can definitely go with the more sensual pleasures, with doing things together that awaken your senses, that allow you to touch in ways that don't just feel like you're petting a dog. Things of that nature you can always do regardless if you're actually having sex or not. And I think that's really, really important. So I'm just hoping that you will have some time to actually do that. And it doesn't take much. It could be 5 minutes of just sitting with each other and being with each other, or 5 minutes of dancing wildly to a piece of music, or anything like that just makes you feel like you're still those two people who had that enjoyment together. And then somebody said, I have a blossoming chemistry with a newish partner. we've been together for 1.5 years, but have been friends for 25 years. Wow. His ex had very severe sexual trauma, and I'm trying to cultivate a little more animal passion, but by encouraging him with my body language and other cues when he really goes for it. I don't want to get into coaching him. Very good choice. What are some of the ways that I can encourage him to be a little bit more aggressive, bold, lead more sexually? That's a really good question. And I also have to say that it's very lovely that you understand that, of course, him being extremely careful and extremely mindful was in service of his previous relationship. And in general, for a lot of partners, right, one of the things that has become an issue is that what we sometimes like you said, the little bit more aggressive, bold, leading sexuality is now often considered toxic or inappropriate or violent. And so it's not that easy to come forth with those things for all kinds of reasons. One of which is that he has been essentially trained through the relationship to not be that. And so, like you're saying, you don't want to get into coaching because then you become his therapist, his mother, or his warden. But you do want the things you want. So here's something you can do that isn't coaching. That's always quite useful. And that is showing things like, let's say, watching something where there is an element of that and going, oh, that's really exciting, or that really turns me on. Or when he does something, be quite exaggerated in your enjoyment of that. Not hysterically, right? You don't have to go full-blown porn star every time he elbows you, right? But there should be some feeling of, yeah, I like this. And then outside of the sexual occasion, right, you can say things like, I've always wanted to try this, or I've always wondered what this would feel like, where you are going on an adventure together. Right. So it's not, you are not doing this right. I need you to do this. This is boring. That never works, obviously. But hey, let's go on an adventure together. And nowadays, that's actually quite easy because there's much better literature, much better information, much better, even like mainstream shows out there where you can kind of see examples of that and talk about it and express yourself. But in general, the attitude can always be, let's explore something. This is what I like. What do you like? Can we try this? I know it might be cheesy or weird, but I always wanted to try this, right? And then it's taken out of, it might not be super sexy to begin with, but it's taken out of the deficiency into experience and the joint excitement. So that would be my suggestion. Wherever you are, there you are. I see you. Okay, Jen, do you have any advice, tips, or exercises on how to move past challenging times such as infidelity after forgiveness and working on individual healing? Yes, I do. And that's a tough one, right? And when I'm saying that's a tough one, that takes a while because like you were saying, there's forgiveness, which is kind of a more mental understanding and making sense of things. And then there's, of course, the emotion, which typically has some pain and often some feelings of not good enough, or what did I do wrong, or why this, there's emotional stuff that's there. You talk about that as healing. But then there's a third aspect, and that's the aspect that goes last. It's when you know what you're doing, actually the easiest to work with, but it's typically the thing that comes last, and that's once again our body. And so in the body, any kind of injury, from severe trauma to an emotional or physical ouch, cause patterns of protection, patterns against kind of like the curl, both emotionally, but also physically, a certain kind of a contraction over a physical injury, things of that form in the body. And then every time, and that is what a trigger is, right? Every time something looks or feels or sounds or reminds you of the original injury, your body reacts, even if your mind and your emotion are well on the way of healing. So what I suggest you do is really very intentionally work with moving your body. And there's many ways to do that. For instance, in somatic experiencing, which is a somatic therapy modality, they do a lot of shaking in nonlinear movement, which is something that I've created as an adjunct to what I do, which is essentially a somatic release method. We move in completely non-linear, non-aligned ways, where essentially we make the entire body participate in the release. There's a specific modality within that is release. If you're interested in that, I teach short, like 1 hour. 1 hour is not that short, but I teach release classes specifically. And then once you've been taught how to do it, you can do it anytime for yourself. There's also lots of certified teachers all over the world. So that's a super easy way to do it. There's also something called the Grimberg method, which is an amazing somatic modality that also releases stuff from the body. So those are kind of 3 resources that help the body release. And I think attending to the body's release is super important. And Casey, maybe you can just post a link to the nonlinear page, because there's also a home practice and a playlist and an exploration. So even if you don't want to come to a class, there's a lot of information on how to actually do that and work with your body. And then we have a few minutes left. What else do we have here? I'm in a beautiful and loving relationship, but before sex, I become so shy. I also find it hard to initiate sex or take charge. If I happen to take charge, I become very aggressive and it feels forced. Great question. Okay, so first of all, shy is sexy. I want to say that, right? There's something incredibly sexy about somebody who is a little bit kind of like, and then opens into the occasion. And clearly your partner likes that, because otherwise he wouldn't be or she wouldn't be with you, right? So you want to kind of almost celebrate the shyness and make the shyness part of the play, because what makes shyness so interesting is that the shyness opens slowly, and when it opens, it's this gradual blooming, and that's something very exciting in the sexual occasion. So I wouldn't feel shy about feeling shy. I would actually kind of play with that. Of course, when you initiate sex, you are suddenly in the go mode, right? You now are taking charge, you know where it's going, and you're gonna apply the full force of your go, which is typically practiced not in the bedroom, but in the boardroom, to your partner. And then, of course, it's going to be a bit clunky and a bit weird and a bit aggressive and not right, because you learned those skills in a context that's not sexual or relational. And so that doesn't necessarily make for hot, sexy stuff. So what I would suggest you do is you start the initiating by bringing your body to your partner's body. So instead of kind of taking the hands or doing the thing or going for the genitals or, like all the things that come with go, is bring your body to your partner's body. Don't use your hands. Kind of be like a slinky, I don't know what, silky. I can only think of reptiles, but reptiles are not that sexy. So whatever you want to be, like maybe a cat, right? Where you like just press up and you move along and you use your body to do the initiation and not your mind and your hands, and just play around with that. So I see there was another question. Is the relationship toolkit course relevant for single? Yes, it is. I'm saying that in the course description as well, because if you can answer those questions for yourself, 3 things will happen, right? Number one, you're going to clarify what you are about, both in what are your values and goals in a relationship, and also what do you bring to a relationship, and then do those things actually align. So it's super important to do that before you start dating and before you engage. And then the third one actually is that you'll notice if there's areas where there's a bit of a rub, or where there's areas where you're not clear, or you need to define things, or you got to work some stuff out. And then you can bring those areas to a qualified professional of any kind, body, mind, soul, heart, and actually prepare yourself so that you can have the relationship you want. So I would highly recommend doing these questions in the toolkit often, right, with your partner. You can also realign, like when you're an empty nester or you've just had children and it's different nowadays, and really engage with that, both personally as well as, you know, in the couple. So that is what I want to say about that. Check out the toolkit. Like I said, we're going to give it to you till Sunday, 447. Then it goes back up to 97. Relationship courses, if you want to dive really deep, it's 5 full-on modules. And if you have some questions that have shown up now and you didn't want to ask them, or you are too shy to ask them, just email us. And I am happy to we often do these podcasts where I answer people's questions in fine detail. So I'm happy to address your questions, should you have some that you didn't want to mention now. Casey just posted all the links for the courses. She posted our email address. You can also find a link to our email address on the website. Thanks, everyone. Bye.